Okay, so right off the bat, uh, Trump's tariffs, right? Genius or just economic suicide? I mean, that's what we're really trying to figure out today, right? And you've given us so much to dig into. Like, we've got everything from like these old trade deals, like way back when, to like really in-depth analysis on what actually happened, on the ground. So our goal, I think it's to like cut through all the noise and figure out what really went down. I mean, you're listening to this because you want the truth, right? Like, what's the real story behind all the headlines? Maybe you're thinking about your business or just like trying to understand the world better. Or maybe you're just, curious. Whatever it is, let's get into it.
Yeah, and it's like a debate that's still going on,
Mm-hmm.
and for good reason. I mean, looking at what you sent over, it's crazy how like the same events, the same people can be seen in such different ways. So before we even get started, we need to like get back to basics. Like, what even is a tariff?
Right, exactly. So basically, like, a tariff is just a tax, right? It's a tax on stuff that's coming into a country. So, like, if a product is imported, boom, extra cost. And governments use these tariffs for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it's to protect their own industries, right? Like, if there's a cheaper product coming in from somewhere else, they might use a tariff to make sure their local businesses can still compete.
Yeah, exactly. Protectionism, right?
Exactly, yeah. But other times, it's like a way to hit back at another country, If they're doing something you don't like in terms of trade, you might slap on a tariff to kind of punish them.
Right. And history has some pretty, interesting examples, like some real cautionary tales, too.
Oh.
Your sources talked about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act
Yeah.
back in the 1930s.
Yeah.
And it's like everyone agrees that this thing made the Great Depression way worse, like way worse.
I mean, wow.
Yeah. So the U.S. was like, okay, we're going to put these huge tariffs on tons of stuff coming in.
Yeah.
Right. And that caused like a global chain reaction. Everyone started putting tariffs on everyone else, and trade just like collapsed.
Yeah.
It's a pretty clear example of how protectionism can totally backfire.
Yeah, like a total economic disaster.
It's wild to think about it now.
Yeah.
Like, how could they not see that coming? But then you've got the Reagan example, right?
Right.
The motorcycle tariffs against Japan in the 80s.
Mm.
And this is where things get kind of interesting because people use this one to say that tariffs can actually work, at least sometimes.
Totally. So back in 1983, Japanese motorcycles were like everywhere. And Harley-Davidson, a true American icon, they were really struggling. So Reagan was like, okay, we're putting tariffs on those Japanese bikes.
Give Harley some breathing room, right?
Exactly. And a lot of people say it actually worked. Harley-Davidson was able to restructure and get back on their feet and start competing again. So it's like a more nuanced example, Like maybe tariffs can work if they're really specific and targeted and the situation is just right. Right. So it's not like black and white, right? Tariffs aren't always good or always bad. It really depends on the context. Like, what's the goal? How are they being used? So that brings us to Trump, right? Like, what did he actually do? It really kicked off in 2018, didn't it?
Yep, March 2018. That's when the tariffs on steel and aluminum came in. 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. And the idea, according to your sources, was to protect those industries, right? They're really important for national security. And Trump wanted to make sure we weren't too reliant on countries like China.
Okay. And then things really escalated with China, right? Like starting in July 2018. And this wasn't just like a few things here and there. It was like a full-blown trade war.
Yeah, it started with $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, and then it just kept going up and up and up. Eventually, the U.S. had tariffs on over $360 billion of stuff coming in from China, like everything from electronics to clothes to you name it. And of course, China didn't just sit there and take it right. They hit back with their own tariffs on American exports, especially farm products like soybeans.
Which reminds me of that infamous soundbite,
Oh, yeah.
the one where Trump says, trade wars are good and easy to win.
Yeah, that's the one.
So that was the attitude, right? Like, we're going in and we're going to win. But what actually happened? Like, what was the real impact? Because you've given us some pretty interesting data here. Let's start with the farmers, because they really seem to get caught in the crosshairs.
Yeah, they definitely did. China's tariffs hit them hard, like soybeans, for example. Exports to China just plummeted. And to help them out, the government ended up giving billions of dollars in subsidies to farmers. Which is kind of interesting, right? Because the whole point of the tariffs was supposed to be helping American businesses, but then they had to turn around and spend all this money to help out another industry that was getting hurt.
Yeah, like a whole unintended consequence there. Okay, so what about the industries the tariffs were supposed to help? Did we see like a big boom in American manufacturing?
Well, it's complicated. Your sources do show some job growth in a few areas like steel and aluminum, a few thousand jobs, which is, good for those people, of course. But it wasn't like this huge widespread thing. And actually some other industries that depended on exports or had these really complex supply chains, they ended up losing jobs.
Right. So it wasn't all sunshine and roses. And then there's the question of how much all this cost regular Americans, right? I remember hearing a lot about how China was going to pay for these tariffs, but the data you sent shows something totally different.
Yeah, that's really important. Like multiple studies from JP Morgan, the Tax Foundation, the Peterson Institute, they all found that it was American consumers who ended up paying a big chunk of these tariffs. Like we're talking about price increases of something like $57 billion per year. So that's like hundreds of dollars more every year for the average family.
Mm.
So the tariffs were on imports, but it was American businesses and shoppers who really felt it in their wallets.
Yeah. Ouch. So looking beyond the money, did the tariffs actually achieve like their bigger goals? I mean, one of the big ones was to reduce the trade deficit, right?
Yeah, and the data actually shows that the trade deficit pretty much stayed the same. So like the tariffs might have changed which specific products were being traded, but they didn't really solve the underlying problems that caused trade imbalances in the first place. Things like national savings and investment rates. And then on top of that, there's the whole issue of global supply chains, right? The tariffs really messed things up there.
Yeah.
It created all this uncertainty and extra costs for businesses that rely on these really complicated networks to get their materials and products around the world.
Right. Okay, so to sum it up, we saw some small wins in a few areas, but farmers and consumers paid a big price, and those big goals like shrinking the trade deficit, they didn't really happen. But now let's look at the other side, right? Like, what's the argument in favor of these tariffs? The whole idea that this was all part of like a grand plan, a negotiating tactic. One of your sources even said like negotiating leverage is everything.
All right, so this is where the whole genius move argument comes in. People who support the tariffs, they say that Trump was using them strategically, like he was trying to shake things up and put pressure on other countries, especially China, to make deals that were better for the U.S. It was basically like, okay, we're going to make things tough for you economically until you give us what we want.
And they point to a few things as like wins, right? Like
Yeah.
USMCA, the new NAFTA deal.
Exactly. Renegotiating NAFTA and getting the USMCA, that's often seen as a success. And some people say that the threat of tariffs, especially on Mexico, helped make that happen. And there are some who say that the tariffs did get some concessions out of China, at least in that phase one trade deal where China said they would buy more stuff from the U.S.
Okay, and there's that historical example too, right? Like the whole idea of using tariffs to protect new industries isn't exactly new. We talked about Lincoln before.
Yeah, exactly. Throughout American history, tariffs have been used for protectionist reasons. Like Lincoln, he was a big supporter of tariffs because he wanted to help American manufacturing grow back in the 1800s. And people use that to say that sometimes you need some short-term pain to get long-term strength and security for your economy.
Right, so the pro-tariff argument is basically like, yeah, it was tough, but it was necessary. It was a way to get leverage to force other countries to make deals and to protect America's interests in the long run. Like a no pain, no gain kind of thing, but on a global scale. Okay, so now let's flip it and look at the other side. What's the economic suicide argument?
So the main point here is that the long-term costs of the tariffs were way bigger than any short-term benefits. People who are against the tariffs, they say it's like a tax on American consumers and businesses that need to import stuff. Like you're making imported goods more expensive, which hurts families' budgets and makes American companies less competitive globally.
And there's also the whole issue of relationships with other countries, right?
Oh, yeah. Huge impact there. The way the Trump administration did these tariffs, like all on their own, it really damaged relationships with some key allies. Instead of working together to solve global trade problems, the U.S. was just doing its own thing. And some people say that made the U.S. weaker overall in terms of its global power and influence.
Right. And then there's how China reacted, right? Did they just give in to the pressure?
Well, it seems like they did negotiate, but they also started making new trade deals with other countries like in Europe and Asia. So some people worry that the U.S. tariffs actually helped push China away from relying on American markets, which could hurt the U.S. in the long run.
Okay, so the economic suicide side is saying that these tariffs were short-sighted, they hurt American consumers, they messed up relationships, and they didn't really change China's behavior in any lasting way. It's like that saying, you don't win a war by shooting yourself in the foot.
Exactly. So we have these two totally different ways of looking at things.
It's like a complete 180, right? Okay, so now let's think about this whole thing through the lens of Trump's art of the deal, right? Like his book lays out his whole approach. Use leverage, think big, maximize options, and protect the downside. So if we look at the tariffs through that framework, it raises some interesting questions like, were these tariffs meant to be a permanent thing, or
Hmm.
were they more like a tool to create chaos and force other countries to renegotiate deals?
Right. That's the big question, isn't it? Was the goal the tariffs themselves, or was it something else? And then there's that idea of protect the downside, like those billions of dollars in subsidies for farmers. That seems to fit right, like a way to soften the blow for a key group that was getting hurt.
Totally. So on the one hand, you've got the supporters saying that the tariffs were this bold move to use leverage and think big, that they forced China to negotiate and make some concessions. But then the critics are saying that all that chaos actually did more harm than good, that China just found other trading partners and the U.S. ended up with all these negative economic consequences. So it really comes down to how you interpret it. Did China really get forced to the table in a meaningful way, or did they just ride it out and find ways to get around the pressure?
Exactly. And that brings us back to square one, you know. Was Trump this brilliant strategist playing 4D chess with global trade? Or was he more like a bull in a china shop causing a bunch of damage without really getting anything in return?
Right. And after looking at all this evidence and hearing both sides, it's still a tough question to answer. Like, there were some short-term wins in certain areas, but then farmers and consumers really took a hit. And what it all means in the long run, well, people are still arguing about that. So we're not trying to tell you what to think. We just want to give you the information and the different perspectives so you can decide for yourself.
Right, exactly.
So here's something to think about. Do you see any signs of Trump's tariff strategies in the trade policies we have today? Like, are there any echoes of that approach still happening? It's an interesting question to consider.
It really is. Like global trade is always changing. And what we learned from the Trump era, whether you agree with it or not, it's going to have an impact on how things play out in the future.
Totally.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Were Trump's tariffs a stroke of genius or a huge mistake? We really want to hear your thoughts. Share them with us. Let's keep the conversation going. And did you find this whole deep dive helpful? Like, did it give you a better understanding of this whole trade war thing? Let us know.
Yeah. And if you found it useful, please share with others. Spread the knowledge.
And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive. We're going to be tackling the question of whether current policies are kind of secretly carrying on some of Trump's trade strategies. You could call it the 2025 tariff talk. Is Biden quietly continuing Trump's strategy? Until then, keep asking questions and keep digging deeper.